Okay, so in this example, we're going to go over another class, and this is a class that will actually extend in a future module to demonstrate inheritance and polymorphism. But for now, we'll just create what will eventually become our base class. And just so that we don't have to use a lot of scope resolution operators all over the place, I'm doing using namespace standard. We could take this out. We would just have to put standard : and then cout or whatever other names we get from that namespace. Okay, so I'm going to call my class staff member. And if you took CS205 from me, this might be a familiar example. And we're going to have our private section, which will have a name, an address, and a phone number. And then our public section, first off, we're going to have a constructor. And actually, let's go ahead and define the constructor here inside the class. Remember, in C++, we can define methods either in the class or outside the class. But here, let's do this in the class. So this constructor, just like in Java, is going to have the same name as the class itself and no return type. And we're going to pass a string in, a string a string p. And actually, let's go ahead and make those const. And the reason is, if we're using these parameters to actually create an object, we're not going to be expecting to change these. So let's just make them const just to be sure that we don't. Normally, you would expect to see something like name equals n, address equals a, and phone equals p. But in C++, at least since C++ 11, I believe, there's actually something called an initializer list. So instead of doing this, if I follow the function signature with a colon, then I can say I want to initialize name with n, address with a, and phone with p. And then my constructor is going to be essentially empty. I don't need a body of the constructor. I still need this to indicate syntactically that the constructor is complete, but I don't have to do all those assignments inside the constructor. And if there was other stuff I needed to do, sure, I could do that. But these simple assignments where I'm taking some parameter and assigning that value to some class member, these initializer lists will take care of that. And I'm also going to have a function called, actually, let's just go ahead and make sure that we have good syntax here at least. So we'll do G++. The standard we're going to use is, we'll use C++ 17. Okay, so I misspelled this. I call this staff member. Again, this is why it's always a good idea to compile and test as you go. And I had a bunch of other, or a couple other errors and warnings, but don't get too hung up on those. Typically with C++, you'll get a lot of warnings and errors. Fix that first one in the recompile. A lot of times the other ones will go away. Once it sees one error, it typically starts generating a bunch of other errors because it can't parse the rest of the file. So yeah, that looks like everything's good there. So we're going to have another public method called print. And we'll define that outside the class. So we're just going to have the method declaration inside the class. We'll define it outside. And of course, this is sort of superfluous in a case where we have one file that's going to have a class definition and a main. Where this comes in handy is when you're dealing with header files and things like that. I'm going to define my print function. However, to indicate to the compiler that this goes with staff member, I need to say that this is I need to specify that this is part of staff member, and I do that with the scope resolution operator. So staff member : print. And what this will do, we'll see out their name, the address and the phone. And then let's try to get these sort of lined up. That looks good. And I think that'll be sufficient for now. So pretty straightforward, just to see out with a string indicating what the field is, the field name and the object, and then an end of line character. So now let's build a few objects of staff member type. So I'll do one called imp1, and I'll do this one with as an actual staff member variable, so I don't have to use new. So there's my first imp, and then I'll make a staff member pointer. And just to keep the line from being so long, I'll just declare the variable here, and then I'll say that imp2 is equal to a new staff member, Bob Smith, and there's their number. So let's print these out. So we'll print employee 1. And for that, again, since this is a stack variable, we'll say emp dot, and then print. Then we'll have an empty line, and we'll say employee 2. And since imp2 is a pointer, that's imp1. Since imp2 is a pointer, we use arrow notation just like we would do with a pointer in C. And once we're done, we'll print that we're done. And again, one thing I want to point out, just in general with your programs, there's nothing noble about having a lot of output. In fact, you want to try to be as sparse with your output as possible. Here we're testing this, and so that's fine. We want to put some output just so that we can make sure it works. But for example, in the constructor, and you'll see some examples that I give you that do have output in the constructor, but typically with a constructor, you don't want to have output because every time you create an object of that type, you're printing a line out. So imagine if you create an array of 1,000,000 of those objects, you're going to go crazy with all the output you get. So typically you want to avoid output, but this is a case where since we're using this to test and to demonstrate, output is a good thing. But you don't have to include it in all your code. Okay, so let's compile this. So you'll see that we have all sorts of errors. And I'm not even bothering to read any of these because typically, again, with C++, you get that first error and then it doesn't know what to do with the rest of the code and thinks it's all an error. And that was a really simple mistake. I should have caught that. And my guess is I think that was the only one I saw. So if I compile, it's going to compile. And we run it, and we see that it printed out the 2 employees followed by done. So there's an example of, or I should say another example of a C++ class. We'll do more advanced things with this in an upcoming module.